Yes, so I'd like to welcome now the next group of panelists to the podium. They will be discussing the current state of DeFi, so continuing with the same topic. And the moderator is Monty Munford, Chief Evangelist at Siena Network. And this is the final session for the day.
Thank you. Maybe a round of applause for our MC. No, don't get enough credit. Thank you. How you going? Welcome to the Graveyard Shift. You still with us, brain-wise? You don't look like you are. I'm Monty Munford. I'm the Chief Evangelist of Siena Network. There's a few things that you said in your speech about the difference maybe between privacy and anonymity. We set up earlier this year, raised 11.2 million on the secret network. So we have, an opinion about privacy and anonymity compared to, KYC and all that stuff. I also write for The Economist, the BBC, long-term career as a journalist. In actual fact, the last time I was around here, I set off a firework that went to Fleet Street somewhere. We used to sit on the steps of KPMG, which is opposite us, on the corner of Whitefriars Street, when we were all dispatch riders. And when I retrained as a journalist, they were quite mad, and I had fireworks, and I fired one. So hopefully this panel will go with a bang, maybe. Maybe some questions from the audience. It seemed like there's some energy that's needed to be injected. I'll introduce our two here, two on Zoom. What could possibly go wrong? So we'll go to Fireblocks first. Just introduce yourself, sir, please.
Yep. My name is Stephen Richardson. I'm VP of Product Strategy and Business Solutions at Fireblocks. Fireblocks is an institutional infrastructure provider for digital assets, servicing north of 600 customers in the digital asset space. And very nice to be here with you guys today.
Thank you very much. Madam?
I'm Veronica McGregor. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Shapeshift Global, which is a crypto trading platform that is now been converted into a DAO. We are decentralizing our entire existence. So that's the process I'm going through right now.
We're all going towards a DAO, right? Also have Ludovic van Zetten here, who's a lawyer, General Counsel for Trilitech.
Thank you. Yes, Trilitech is a Tezos ecosystem company. We assist DeFi players in developing their protocols and deploying them on the Tezos blockchain.
Thank you. Madam.
As you already know, my name is Ksenia Bazian. I'm the CMO for Polkadx, and we're building the decentralized trading platform. How institutions come into the picture is that we've seen the huge demand from institutions, and we're trying to address the issue of institutions not being able to come into DeFi. And we're essentially providing the technology and providing the gateway for institutions to come to crypto.
Thank you very much. I was lucky enough to be part of a webinar yesterday on regulation in DeFi. And one of the subjects that came up was the geographical differences between the US, between Asia and Europe. And it would appear that Europe is doing quite well in being a pioneer or being forward-thinking when it comes to regulation. I'm sure you're sick and tired of regulation, but it's a very important thing, right? How would you see the difference between those three territories? Would you agree with me?
Definitely, I see the huge difference because, for example, for our product, we can do simple token swaps anywhere in the world, but the order book is not allowed to be held in US, for example, due to regulations or the lack of regulations.
Which sounds a bit like the gambling industry 20 years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Ludovic, what would you say to that, about the difference between, would you say that Europe's ahead?
Define ahead. I think there is an element of caution in Europe right now, but as you may be aware, Europe is thinking about white paper liability and issuer liability. I hope certainly that will not be implemented as planned. Reason is that it seems to have a misconception of exactly how it is that the chain works. We've seen many people today and yesterday try and pinpoint who is responsible, what are the responsibilities. Obviously, in a decentralized system, you need a different conceptual approach. So to reach back in time to issue a liability, a prospectus liability, that seems not to be ahead. So at the moment, what you can see is, you have some space, but because it isn't regulated yet, and in that space, it is ahead. But you have to be quite careful about what the future will bring if it's misunderstood.
Or by everybody, or just everyone in the industry?
So the Americans obviously have the ancient concept of investment contract, which means that anything you sell that has a promise of a profit could possibly mean that you need to register that particular asset. Time has shown that that is a very flexible concept. I think it is not necessarily a bad thing to look at it that way. It has to be seen where the line will be drawn. And again, decentralization in that concept is understood. So the SEC has said, if you have sufficient decentralization, you might not be a registrable asset or security. So in my view, that is in a way being ahead.
Okay, that's your definition of being ahead. Veronica, where are you based? I'm sorry, I don't know where you are.
San Francisco Bay Area. So I am fully aware of what the United States is doing. We're global, as most of us are at this point, but definitely keeping I keep my eye on the U.S. What's different about the U.S. Besides some of our definitions of investment contracts is that not only do we have to consider federal laws, we have to consider state laws, depending on how you're moving money. Each state has a money transmitter statute, and some states have specific statutes for cryptocurrencies. On top of that, we have a bunch of federal regulators, many of whom are trying to oversee the space with varying levels of success and clarity. So it's difficult to navigate the United States for sure.
So the current state of DeFi in the US, the kind of fragmentation there is holding things back.
Exactly. I would absolutely agree with that statement.
And how would you...
And not just DeFi, but like fintech in general, from the get-go. But definitely in the DeFi space, it's even more muddy.
How do you unwrap that then? How do you make it easier?
Well, there is no making it easy. That'd be nice. If I had the secret to making it easy, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But essentially, what you have to you either have to block places and not accept consumers or users from those places. Like we don't take users from New York, or you have to sort of pick a regulatory compliance strategy that covers everything. And so those are your choices. You have to either cover everything or block things you can't comply with.
So you have a fragmented thing in the States, but you also want a global solution. I mean, how's that going to happen? I don't see how that can be unwrapped.
So whatever you just said was completely fuzzy and static.
That's the same for me as well. So there should be a global regulatory mission, but you're saying that even in the US there's so many different laws and statutes in states. How on earth is that going to happen?
Yeah, good question. We've been trying for a long time to just even, not even just with crypto, as I said, with all fintech, to get some sort of regulatory regime that would be applicable, and just one to a specific type of industry. We haven't succeeded yet. We have some very strong industry groups that are working on making it easier to comply with regulation, but it is I refer to it as a patchwork minefield in the United States. So you have to choose the lowest common denominator, basically pick the most restrictive thing and comply with that, or as I said, block people from places with which you don't, you can't comply,
Okay, thank you very
like
much.
New York.
Stephen, where are you?
Sure.
I'm typically based out of Singapore.
Okay, so what's it like in Asia, just to put, big territory together?
Yeah, look, I would say if you kind of look at, in my opinion, where leading regulatory bodies are at the moment, for me, they're in Switzerland, Germany with BaFin and MAS in Singapore. MAS has taken a pretty forward-thinking view, that's the monetary authority of Singapore here, around things like engaging with digital assets. They've built fintech and innovation labs. They're directly investing in the space and technology in the space. And they've created, I think, a pretty clear and comprehensive regulatory framework with the Digital Payments Act that basically governs what type of companies and licenses are needed to operate within digital assets. There's been some broader basis. I think one of the things that is pretty different, right, and to the point that Veronica was making, right, there is this landscape of multiple different regulatory bodies within the United States, from the executive branch to the legislative branch, into different agencies that all have entirely different agendas when it comes to digital assets. If you look at places like Singapore and MAS, right, there's a singular basis by which basically rules and regulations are rolled out, and the ability to have one singular touch point for a lot of the industry in terms of advocating for regulations that make it conducive to operating in digital assets in the space. I think similarly with BaFin, right, you're seeing a very similar take. And then in Switzerland, the same has been done, right? And so you've seen an advanced framework that exists in those jurisdictions, I think, in comparison to almost anywhere else. And the thing that we're seeing that is pretty significant is that a lot of the other jurisdictions in places like Asia, so Thailand, the Philippines, Hong Kong, et cetera, are looking at, in essence, Singapore as a basis of kind of structuring the rest of the regulation in order for their kind of broader digital asset economies and companies and fintechs to be competitive in that geo space. So I think that's a pretty interesting thing, this level of like innovation and competition. I think recently the new study came out that said, from INSEAD, that said, Switzerland, Singapore and the US are kind of among the top areas to grow talent. But we're seeing I'd say from a fintech perspective, places like Switzerland and Singapore are absolutely leading the charge in terms of clarity and regulation for folks to be able to operate.
So the state of DeFi means that if you're a DeFi company, you're likely to move to a place that has jurisdiction, kind of maturity.
I would agree. I mean, you're seeing companies, I know of, having been based in Singapore, multiple companies that basically do things like derivative products or other DeFi type applications that have moved from the US, right? So I think it's interesting. Look, I think US always still holds at this point in time a competitive advantage in terms of technology and technologists, right? But I think the lack of regulation, and the ability for your folks to potentially be on the hook for things coming down from the SEC on through, puts a bit of a question mark in people's minds as to how they grow the business and how they recruit talent and build different services that might step afoul of the current regulatory structure.
Interesting.
But I want to point out,
Sure.
Simply moving offshore for the United States anyway, simply moving your business offshore, or offshore sounds
Of course.
somewhere else, does not really solve everything, of course, because the United States laws in particular, if you're doing business with users in the United States, you're on the hook for those laws that affect that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Ludovic,
Look, I mean, it's a mixed problem. Other folks in large centralized exchanges had this problem. It will not be unique, to that. I mean, it'll start to make itself apparent in things like DeFi as well, right?
Yeah.
Even if things in the protocol and kind of the governance is decentralized, there's always still a somewhat centralized team of individuals and developers and other things, right? So folks have to start to pay attention to how they limit the interaction of consumers in jurisdictions where you can't operate.
Yeah, understood. Ludovic, we were talking earlier about, is it FATF? Or
FATF.
FATF, tell me about FATF. Does anyone know what FATF is? Hands up, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Oh, not
Yeah, the
so many.
Financial Action Task Force,
Yeah.
which is a central body of countries basically setting AML standards. And it's been around for a while, and it has recently invented the term VASP, which is a virtual asset service provider, and is trying to identify again, and because we're speaking about DeFi here, trying to identify again a person who is responsible for AML duties. You basically see three regulatory realms that sort of circled any financial services space, but also here in DeFi in particular. So it's the FATF standard. So you need to sort of identify who you're dealing with. Not just that, you also need to assess the risk of this person. So it's not just knowing who the person is, but seeing if that person is someone you can deal with, and then you need to monitor what they're up to. So
How many countries have signed up to FATF? Can't say it.
FATF.
FATF.
FATF rules. Yeah.
FATF. How many countries have signed up?
Most in the world, I think, and not all directly. So there's a whole bunch of countries that sign up through sub-bodies.
Okay.
But you have to go to Yemen and other places to kind of not be FATF-able.
FATF-able.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Your opinion on that?
I think it's a very interesting topic because it's like a clash of different perspectives. Because the perspective of crypto native people is that there's no bad actor. So all the transactions are peer-to-peer, and essentially you have to trust each other. But crypto was not built for this many people as we see in DeFi now. So there has to be some regulation, but it's essentially showing how fractured the world is in that sense.
One of the things that kind of irritates me about regulation in crypto is obviously there should be regulation of social networks and what Facebook is trying to do. Is there a case that everyone's waiting to see what happens with Facebook, what the SEC says about Facebook, what's going to happen to Facebook, and then afterwards there will be regulation for DeFi?
I think we shall just wait and see. Nobody knows how is it going to work, but the current trend is that regulators are coming after different crypto companies. But there hasn't been any really bad case scenario for any of the players who were affected.
It seems like there's a guillotine hanging over DeFi companies that at some stage this will take your head off.
Exactly.
Is that holding the state of DeFi is the headline of the panel? Is that what's happening?
I think so. I think, again, there is a clash between people who are native in crypto and who don't want to have any regulations. But there is a certain need for regulations because to grow, DeFi needs masses to come to DeFi.
Yep.
So the masses are coming through institutional side, and institutions need to be compliant.
Ludovic, you're about to...
So I'm very optimistic about it because what we see and what I find past 2 days fascinating because you do learn a lot about what everybody else is up to. And what you see is a lot of tools are being built to make this work and to get varying degrees of, you see it in the tokenization platforms where they're already able with sort of middleware protocols to block, track and see what's going on. What needs to happen still, and education, I think there's a lot of confusion still in the system. There's certainly a lot of bad jargon that isn't helping anyone. Just think of the word wallet, for instance. I mean, why do we use that word? So you could go on for a bit, but what you also see is convergence and towards consumption. And that's why I said earlier, I know that the US is a problem for many people, but that's all focused around the token and flowbacks of the token. But the fact that the key regulator is really thinking about decentralization and what a balance is of decentralization is enormously helpful for DeFi, and that will run its course.
Yeah, okay. Veronica, based in the US, one of the things that came up in the conversation yesterday with the UN and all these things that were going on is that a lot of this comes back to 9/11, comes back to the Patriot Act. and about know your customer and money laundering. That sounds to me like that was an amazing opportunity to bring this together about who someone was, what know your customer was. Is that holding DeFi back as well? Anywhere?
Well, so to be clear, in the US, we had know your customer rules before the Patriot Act was enacted. That's always been a part of banking, is kind of know your customer, know who it is you're dealing with. But those rules got stronger with the Patriot Act. The KYC stuff it definitely makes it tougher for DeFi participants to build their systems, depending on what sort of users they're using and what sort of what sort of users they have, and what sort of regulatory regime they're trying to comply with. FATF, has some rules that they're trying to implement that will make that even tougher, I think, based on the way information travels on blockchain and what information is available and what isn't available. That is definitely one of the sticking points. One of the bigger sticking points, though, at least in the US, is the lack of clear regulation and what really applies to what you're doing. And that is for us in this country, one of the biggest complaints about regulation. It's not we don't want any regulation, it's that we want clear regulation. So we don't have the guillotine effect, right, that you're referring to. Like, we want to know how to comply and what to comply with, and we have so many regulatory agencies weighing in on different facets of the industry that it is murky.
Yeah, murky is definitely the word. DEXs, non-regulated, how's that going to change things? How can that be changed?
Definitely, majority of DEXs are not regulated now, and we know the case of Uniswap being heavily prosecuted at the moment exactly for this, because they're trading security tokens. They cannot identify participants of the trade. So the way we see it and the way we try to protect Polkadox from going through the same path as Uniswap is approaching it through the decentralized KYC way. So in this way, we can, the blockchain can verify people who are participating in the trade, but it doesn't reveal the full information. So the information is kept aside, it's kept very privately, unless it is needed, unless someone in the trade is called out as a bad actor, essentially.
Maybe it's my ignorance, but what's the difference between Polka DEX and Polka Starter?
Oh, there's a huge difference. Two completely different companies. Polka Starter
that's
is
what
a
I thought when I
launchpad.
asked that question.
Yeah.
I thought you'd answer that. Okay, right. Thank you very much for destroying my career. That's excellent.
Sorry, didn't mean to.
No, it's all right. It's just my fault. I get confused with all the acronyms.
But also, if I may just tack into that, right? So what are you going to regulate? So again, you can't find a person. So you have to say something about the protocols. And then you need to ask questions about what do you require to be built in. And it's not just, I think, the FATF stuff. It's also treating customers fairly. So, you get pricing problems, all the old problems, best execution, questions like that. And if regulators focus on how these protocols are built rather than who's doing it, then you maybe get conceptually a better approach.
Sorry, after you, please.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the DEXs are going through two main issues. First of all, there's a token that is highly speculative thing usually. So the current trend is that companies are creating utility tokens. So this is one side of it. Another side, that DEXs cannot know who is trading on them, and they cannot know what is the essence of the transaction. So this part we're trying to cover through decentralizing KYC. So we keep the benefits of KYC process, but include the blockchain in there.
Right, exactly. And you also have to think about things like front running, when trades get into the network before they roll up in a block. All of these things need to be regulated rather than a person.
That's what Siena's trying to fix, is front running, by the way. Because the weirdest thing for me is that if I have a crypto transaction, send it to you, if I owed you 100 quid, right, I send it to Lloyd's, fine, no worries. But if I sent you 100 quid in crypto, I could see all of your transactions that you'd ever made. ever, and you can see mine. It just seems insane.
Become a flash boy.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Over to Singapore and to Stephen, as a product guy, how does all this fit in? I mean, obviously Singapore is advanced in some respects when it comes to regulation, but how does it kind of work, or maybe you could explain to me and the audience, how DeFi and CeFi, you know, an increasingly used acronym, how do they work together, or are they two separate things?
Yeah, so look, I think we're seeing some pretty interesting things here. You know, for example, Fireblocks is working with Aave on creating a institutional lending pool, right? So basically, where all the participants are whitelisted, right, which can go through KYC. As such, then you know the interaction partners that you have within that pool. While you don't know definitive identity, you know they've been KYC'd at a common standard level. Now, what I think is a pretty interesting thing that we're seeing a lot of discussions around as well is, the capabilities and the tools in DeFi are starting to be, I think, analyzed at a centralized finance level, right? So there's a view as to, for a lot of these different protocols, right? The idea is that one, there's within the smart contract level, there's a proof of funds, right, execution basis is done, right? There's the ability to have, in essence, an order book and an execution basis, and then there's an inherent settlement mechanism. Well, what do FMIs do, right?
What's an
other
FMI?
institutional.
Excuse me, just acronym. What's
Yeah. So it's basically, it's like a financial institution, right? So like if you look at CSDs, right, like SIX or Euroclear or Clearstream or these other components, right? They in essence basically act as centralized entities to clear and settle trades, right? So if you think about what a lot of those components do is, right, they have banks that interact with these institutions, right? They post capital, they settle, trades are dropped in, they're confirmed, and then those trades are then settled, right? And basically the assets move between, institution one or institution two within the custody of this centralized entity.
Right.
Now, ideally, right, these folks are looking at digital as a first stepping stone to say, okay, within this digital space, right, could I use protocols that we're seeing in the DeFi space that would allow me to understand where capital and collateral have been locked, basically look at trade execution, and then look at direct P2P settlement of those assets within the basis that I, as this centralized entity, potentially are kind of the governance structure behind how settlement might occur, right? And that theoretically, right, I can start to then open up these components to more and more players in the space and use this technology application rather than my ability to have like regulation govern that I must be the point of, central clearing and settlement, right? And so we're seeing basically a lot of banks, for example, even start to say, how do I disintermediate these centralized entities by using DeFi protocols or DeFi applications to basically settle bank to bank, right? Without the need for this FMI infrastructure. So, that's where I think things are really interesting, right? I think this was something that was brought up earlier, is if we look at the technology and the protocol itself, rather than who's doing it, there's a lot of really interesting things that potentially can be kind of expanded on and then put in a clear regulatory structure, right? Like the fact
such as
go ahead.
What are these interesting things, such as what?
So, for example, right, at the end of the day, bank-to-bank clearing, right, and utilizing a smart contract or the ability to do pre-funding, right, and understand that basically those funds are there for settlement, reduces a lot of just generic counterparty risk within the system, right? Counterparty risk that goes on to things like balance sheet that you have to account and fund for, that have costs inherently in the system, right? Like you look at what happened with Robinhood and their inability when, look at when folks wanted to buy GameStop, right? Their inability to really post collateral, get the asset, and then clear the asset because of this existing infrastructure. Now imagine if you had a DeFi or a protocol that basically could see that you had capital in a digitized way, or you had a tokenized security, and you could clear that on a protocol basis rather than relying on this existing infrastructure. And you could do it across a broader network or an even bigger network of systems across geos, right? Because the protocol is geo-agnostic. So those are some of the things. Now, they're big pictures, but you're seeing banks and innovation labs start to think about what that means, right? And how that might work, right? And I think that is actually a very interesting and very disruptive thing, right? And now you're seeing CSDs and these centralized entities say, oh, wow, there's potential that we might, because of this technology, get disintermediated by the customers that we serve because they can go directly to each other. So we actually need to step in and think about what are the opportunities here to engage and leverage this technology. And I think that's what
very
this
interesting.
kind of
You've broken my brain with the acronyms, but very interesting. Veronica, you're nodding your head in agreement there.
Yes, but I don't have anything to add. I just agree.
Oh, okay, fine, brilliant.
I was just like, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, absolutely. Oh God, brain. One of the things, Ludovic, that we were talking about, apart from FATF, correct, is MICA, M-I-C-A, which is something that's going to the EU at the moment, where paragraphs are being taken out. Maybe you could explain to the audience who do or do not know what that is.
Yeah, we touched briefly on it at the start when you asked about geographic differences and whether or not Europe is ahead. So if MICA is implemented, it's a wonderful example of people trying top-down to sort of define what's going on. So say, oh, we have utility tokens, we have to try to classify the tokens. Bad idea, right? Because you don't know what they will be or what they do exactly. They change all the time, so it's nonsensical. And then they try to identify an issuer and say, okay, the issuer is responsible for the white paper. Again, that would be liability for what's in the protocols, which are also constantly changing. So whoever came up with that, I think it's a fantastic effort.
I agree as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So I said, I don't, look, I was in a BVI until about a month ago. So my outlook was DeFi in a relatively lightly regulated space, I will admit that. And there was a lot of US context going on, so there's a lot of worry about token issuers in the DeFi protocols and governance questions, decentralization. None of that I don't see that discussion in Europe. I may be missing a large bit of the landscape, but you know, if they're going down that road, then it's not going to help anyone.
Senya, agree?
Yes, definitely. My view is that we're moving towards the structure where everything is kind of in a hybrid mode. So there are a lot of things that DeFi lacks now and a lot of gray areas that have to be taken up to a certain point. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that centralized finance can learn from decentralized applications.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're kind of going to have to wrap up soon. Veronica, you didn't have much to say last time I spoke to you. Tell us about Shapeshift. Let's do this backwards. What are you doing to change the DeFi?
Well, you know, honestly, what we're doing right now, as I said, is we're decentralizing. So we are quite literally, as I said, we turned our trading platform over to token holders. We have a native token. Those holding those tokens get to participate in the governance and decision-making of the platform. And that's an active DAO now. And we are dismantling the company and, you know, liquidating the balance sheet and forming a foundation to support the DAO, and the company itself is going away. And that is because that is sort of the ultimate ethos of crypto is completely decentralized. And so that's the path we're taking.
That sounds like a nice path. Stephen, Fireblocks, what are you doing? Shill for 2 minutes.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, we're an infrastructure provider. So we provide the broader backbone for how folks can engage in digital assets. So that's the wallet infrastructure. I know that name came up earlier, but really the private key infrastructure that secures the digital assets. and the connectivity in the space, right? So connectivity to exchanges, DeFi platforms, and other market participants to really enable kind of seamless settlement of digital assets across 700 different tokens and applications. So we do that for the likes of banks like BNY Mellon and Revolut and quite a number of other financial institutions, but also leading institutions within the crypto space from folks like B2C2 and others. So our goal and our job is to really think about innovation as a basis of enabling customers to drive revenue and new products in the space overall.
That sounds like a lovely path as well. Thank you very much. Polka Dex, not Polka Starter. I've got that one right, thank God.
I think I've been shilling the project way too
You
much
did
in the
actually
past
do that.
hour. Yes.
Ludovic, it might be you down to the last word as a general counsel. What does that mean? It's just a lawyer or smart lawyer.
Well, it means, I think, exactly what it says, as you counsel generally.
Well, I think that might just be a perfect way to end it. Let's have one question before we go and have a drink. Anyone's got a question? And who you are and anybody? No questions. Yes, thank you, madam. Please just tell us who you are and how you're connected to this space and who it's directed to.
My name is Ijomo Okoli. I'm a finance and regulatory lawyer. I had a general question. I think there are a lot of comments about the regulators. I get it. It's not clear. But has the industry considered actually working with the regulators? I know Coinbase had a proposal for self-regulatory organization that in the frame that you have in the security sector and also with the commodity sector. But has the industry considered working with the regulators to try to get them to a place where they need to be? Because one of the things, Chairman Gensler has been, speaking a lot, and there are a number of things that were brought up today, including, the whole the fact that, from his point of view, some of the things that are called decentralized are not, in fact, decentralized. It's essentially a misnomer. Has the industry basically considered working with the regulators? Because that may be a path forward.
Anybody? First go. Veronica,
we, as an industry, we certainly work with the regulators. One of the ways to do that is to try and make sure they understand what they're regulating. As is evidenced by, the number of acronyms and other sort of confusing jargon in the industry, and just the technology itself, which is cutting edge and changing all the time. One of the things that we have lots of trade groups, GDF in Europe and the UK more, and we have a bunch of other groups, Blockchain Association and Digital Chamber of Commerce and others in the US that routinely interact with regulators and lawmakers in order to make sure that they hear our voices and understand the technology and what it is they're trying to regulate, so that we can have effective and sensible regulation.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I joined Trading Tech, so I get induced into the Tezos system. So I spent 2 days earlier in the week with French math PhDs explaining to me exactly how the chain works, and you think you know something. Mm-mm. So there is a real challenge communicating about exactly, as you say, exactly as what it is and how it all works. So the effort that needs to be made by the person who is trying to regulate that is quite substantial, and it's not simply a matter of showing the data.
Okay, is that good enough answer? Yeah. Okay, well, maybe chat afterwards in the drinks. Thanks to our Zoomers. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Stephen. Especially you, Stephen. The only thing that I can think of now, acronym-wise, is FFS, because my brain is gone. Fuck's sake. But thanks for your...
My financial market infrastructure, but it skipped my mind for a second when I was talking to you. So
well, listen, it's all slipped my mind. Don't worry. But thank you for being involved. To our virtual panelists and our 2 physical panelists, I hope that gave you some information.